So I've got this old Gibson guitar. This thing was made in the 1920s, and I'm sure it has a lot of stories to tell. Needs some new strings and a little love. When I pick up this guitar, I wonder who's played it and what did they play on it. And, you know, I can't help but think they probably played a little blues at some point. Maybe a little jazz. Who knows, some folk songs. How many hands have played this guitar? And what did they play? And what stories does this instrument have to tell me? So, everything you touch vibrates. Everything you touch resonates. Everything that resonates also resonates within you. When we hear sounds, when we hear music, it's not just the ears that are vibrating, not just your eardrums that are vibrating. It's everything that sound touches. Sound does not focus itself into your eardrum. Sound comes through every pore in your body. It vibrates every membrane, every tissue of your body. That's why we understand music the way we do. And that's why the way things vibrate, the way a string vibrates when you pluck it, is the same vibration that we feel. We vibrate the same way the string does. We vibrate in sympathy. We resonate in sympathy with that vibrating string, or the sound coming out of a trumpet, or a saxophone, or a piano. And, you know, and maybe it's psychological, maybe it's mysticism, but the vibrations that have been put into this instrument over 100 years, I think they're still there. And I want to find them. And that's what this is all about. It's not just making music, but finding it and revealing it and understanding it in the way that we understand as human beings. We understand everything that we do, at least on some level, using words, describing and discussing these things using words. And if we can come to a common understanding of what we're doing musically and have a common language to describe it, so much the better. So that's what this is about. So this music we call blues does not originate with 1-4-5 patterns, dominant seventh chords. It does not originate with this thing we call the diatonic system. The musical forms that become the blues come from some part of Africa. Some part of Africa that did not necessarily meet European culture until that time. And when you think about it, I mean, it should be obvious that there were many African musical cultures that were in communication with European musical cultures prior to slavery in the United States and the abolition of slavery in the United States. It's not that the first time people from Africa brought music to the Western world or to the white world and had a chance to infuse that music into the culture of Europe. Why didn't the blues happen then? Why didn't it happen long ago, before the late 1800s? There was something about the musical culture, that particular musical culture at that particular time, that led to this particular musical form that didn't exist in the way we now experience it. And what is it exactly that makes it what it is? And this is the big discussion that we have about blues. What is blues and what is it not? And I kind of have a joke about that. Every jazz station, if you listen to the radio, I mean, fewer and fewer people listen to the radio these days, but I used to listen to jazz radio stations all the time and rock and roll radio stations all the time, driving in my car, sitting at home. And one thing I noticed was that rock stations always had, on like Sunday at 2 in the morning or Sunday at midnight or something, a blues show where they'd play only blues. And jazz stations also had that. The jazz stations, maybe there was a jazz station had a little earlier in the evening, a blues program where they played only blues. And they would define everything they played as blues as opposed to jazz. This isn't jazz, this is blues. And the rock stations, this isn't rock, this is blues. There's a difference. There's a thing that happens in blues that doesn't happen in rock, and vice versa. And I thought, well, how do you know whether something's really blues and when it's rock, or when it's really blues, or if it's jazz? And I decided that the best way to really know was to listen to those blues shows. And if the rock station and the jazz station both played a song on their blues program, it was really blues, because jazz stations didn't play rock. And rock stations, well, occasionally they'd play a jazz tune, but usually not. So I thought, well, if the rock station thinks it's blues and the jazz station thinks it's blues, then it must be. Because, they must know what they're talking about. So, I mean, what is the blues? What is it really? There are a few things that you gotta have. I mean, you gotta have that thing I call 712. Now, I'm applying a diatonic name to this, right? We apply diatonic terminology to the blues all the time. And if we do that, if you're going to apply diatonic terminology to this music that does not start with the diatonic system, then you got to figure it out, right? You've got to figure out what it is. And you've got to make sense out of it in those terms. And that's where we all get into trouble with it, right? Because we it's like, well, it's all about the scale. It's all about the scale. But what is that scale even, right? And it's an approximation. I guess what I'm getting at is it's all an approximation of something that exists apart from the way we describe it. And it's come to be sort of focused into this box and these frets and those piano keys. But it starts with the voice, and it starts with instruments that didn't even have frets. There was an instrument called the banjo, and most of us think of the banjo as an instrument of bluegrass music. It's this big, happy, loud, punchy instrument with a skinny long neck and a drum at one end and frets. But the original instrument did not have frets, and it existed long before there was anything called bluegrass. And if you don't have frets and you don't have the diatonic system and you start with the voice, you're going to sing notes that are not neatly encased in mixolydian modes and pentatonic scales and 6-note scales. You're going to have microtones. You're going to have all sorts of subtleties and nuances. And this is why we bend. Why we bend strings on the guitar. We're trying to find those microtones, but we have to start with the frets. We have to start with them because they're there. They're there, first of all. But we're looking for those notes in between the frets. we're trying to find the voice. The voice that doesn't have, the voice does not have frets. The voice does not know even what a scale is. The voice is continuously variable, but the voice does have something that the string has, with or without frets. The voice has overtones, what we call overtones. The voice has harmonics. The voice has resonant frequencies that it finds that are more resonant, some more resonant than others, some it's drawn to more than others. And you feel that. When people talk about playing what you feel, where do you feel it? Do you feel it here? I don't think so. You feel it here and here and everywhere else, in your sinuses, up your nose. I mean, it sounds funny, right? But if the sound goes in the hole in the side of your head and hits your eardrum, and your sinuses inside here are connected to your inner ear, we all know that the sinuses, when you have a stuffy nose, it affects your hearing. If you cover your nostrils and you blow, you're going to pop your eardrums. Your sinuses are connected to your inner ear. Sound goes up your nose. You hear with your nose. You feel sound in the membranes in your forehead. Is this scary? Is it weird? No more weird than anything else in human physiology. But we're not going to talk about that, really. We're talking about this instrument. We're talking about the blues. And I mean, I'm not going to pretend to know what the blues is. All I can pretend to know is how I approach it, how I relate to it, how I shake hands with it. And it allows me in, if it does. Now, I was playing blues in G in the other video because G is the dominant chord. G dominant is the one chord in blues in G, and it's the 5 chord of the key of C diatonically, which means that we can talk about the notes of the blues 1 chord without flatting anything, without changing any notes. Because we can say that this chord has a flat 7, that the dominant 7th chord has a flat 7, and we're speaking relative to a G major scale. If you play a G dominant 7th chord, you're playing a chord with a flat 7 relative to a G major scale. But if you recognize that that chord is the 5 chord of the key of C major, then you're not flatting anything. You're just playing the 7 that happens to be there. And the 7 of the dominant 7th chord is an F. The 7 of the G dominant 7th chord is an F. And the F is the 4 of the key of C. Note number 4 of the key of C. So when you play 5, 6, 7 off of that dominant 7th chord, what are you playing in the key of C? You're playing 2, 3, 4 in the key of C. 2, 3, 4. D, E, F in the key of C. That sequence becomes the center. 2, 3, 4. The 4 of the key of C is the 7 of the dominant 7th chord. 4 and 7. This is getting very numerological. 4 and 7 in the key of C is F is 4, B is 7. B is the 3rd of that dominant 7th chord. 4 and 7 of the key of C, 3 and 7 of the G dominant 7th chord. This is what we call a tritone. The tritone is central in blues, in jazz. You really can't understand this stuff without the tritone. And there's a lot of mythology around the tritone. The tritone is thought to be evil. It's the devil's interval, etc., etc. Well, there's a lot of that mythology is exaggerated. The tritone in classical music was never really prohibited, but it was treated very carefully. It was treated as something you had to really understand to use it correctly. And you didn't just throw it around, toss it around everywhere. And perhaps the use of the tritone, the ubiquity of the tritone in blues, I mean, it's everywhere in blues and in jazz, was regarded as such a violation of basic sort of music practices in the late 19th and early 20th century, that music, the sort of the powers that be in the music theory universe at the time, thought that this music that was coming out of these guitars and at the time banjos and whatnot of these people who had only been slaves a few years before were making this music that was noise, that was not even music. This is primitive banging and screaming was noise, and the tritone was cacophony, and how this is just nonsense, they thought. The blues ends up winning this confrontation, and the tritone becomes the center of a musical form that gains legitimacy. It was always legitimate, but it gains legitimacy in the serious music world over time, when classical composers start drawing on some of these ideas and exploring them. And you end up with something called the Rhapsody in Blue, but you also end up with real jazz, and you end up with blues as the seed that grows into an entire different musical universe than existed before, really. And we don't talk about the tritone all that much, and we don't talk about the placement of the tritone all that much in these chords, but you got to have that, right? So you can distill everything down to the tritone in blues. You can say, okay, I've got my dominant seventh chord. Where's the tritone? There's the tritone. It's between the 7 of the chord and the 3 of the chord, which is to say the 4 and the 7 of the mother key. F and B. You got to have your F and B, man, And then you go to the 4 chord. Well, that's a C dominant 7th. And the same thing happens again. It just shifts. So the tritone has now shifted and inverted down a half step. So we've got an E and a B flat. E and B flat, the 7 and the 3rd of the E dominant 7th, the 7 and the 3rd of the C dominant 7th chord. And then we've got our D7, we've got an F sharp, and a C, which is the 3rd and the 7th of the D dominant 7th. And when we add it all up, we have a tritone here, down a half step for the 4 chord, back to the 1, we've got our tritone where it started, and then up here, and then down here, and then down here. So we have 3 tritones in a row, chromatically, meaning a half step apart. So the first one's in the middle, we go down a half step to the 4, back to the middle, up a half step from 1 to 5, down a whole step from 5 to 4, and up a half step from 4 to 1. So we take this 1-4-5 idea and turn it into, or distill it down, boil it down to the movement of the tritone in 3 different positions. And really, if you think about it, that's kind of the core of blues 1-4-5. It is not diatonic 1-4-5. Diatonic 1-4-5 is 3 major chords. One of them a major 7. The next one also a major 7. And the 5 a dominant 7. This is a diatonic 1-4-5 if you add the 7th to each of these chords. But blues 1-4-5 is maybe 9th chords. Getting jazzy here. That's a language all to itself. Where does that language come from? Of course, it's a fusion of a musical form that really comes from essentially a lost language and has sort of risen from those ashes. In a previous video on the subject of blues, I played blues in G, the key of G. And this idea was the beginning of the video. I started here with this idea now, and I talked about how we can play it that way. And usually that's what you will find when people are playing blues rhythms. You'll hear a bar chord, you'll see a bar chord playing it that way. And one day I kind of realized that this fingering was a little easier. My hand was bothering me, so I had to look for another way to do it. And that's what I did. I found that, and I thought, what's going on there? That's, of course, Mixolydian mode. You may be familiar with Mixolydian mode. It's the major scale with the lowered 7th step, the flat 7. Technically a minor 7. And 5, 6, 7, based on that chord, based on that scale. That's what that thing is about. And I think about this as a blues rhythm, but it's linked to those notes. It's linked to that particular musical phrase, and the rhythm comes out of that musical phrase. Rhythm and tonality are always connected, especially in music like blues, but they're always connected. What you play, what notes you play, and when you play them make all the difference in any piece of music. It's not just the notes. And very often we get so focused on what notes we're playing, and we overlook the rhythmic aspect of the music and how that's connected. Rhythm isn't just something you add on to music. So you really can't talk about blues as a musical form without talking about rhythm. But you can't really talk about it without talking about the notes either. So we got to link them. We got to find a way to connect what you play note-wise and when you play it. There's an old cliche that there are no wrong notes. It's been attributed to a number of people. I think Miles Davis probably is the usual attribution. It's not a wrong note. You just played it at the wrong time. Put the focus on how notes fit together in time. Every single note you play is a temporal phenomenon. Temporal meaning time. It's all about time. And not just when you play the note, but the note itself is about time. Individual notes are vibrations. A vibration is when something moves back and forth. A certain number of times per second is usually the way we think about it. How many times per second does this string vibrate? Well, if a string is producing a single note by vibrating a certain number of times per second, and that note will change if those vibrations change in time, then every single note is time. Music is always time. And on the micro level, each note is its own world of time. And on a macro level, the sequence of notes combined over a longer period of time than simply 1 second tells you something. It tells a story. Probably the most typical or the most central rhythmic idea in blues is the triplet. And when we talk about triplets in blues, we're talking about a particular approach to the idea of the triplet. If you play a rhythm that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and you play 2, 3, 4, well, that's not it. But if you take that and you divide it into threes, 1, 2, 3, 4, or if this is simply an outline of the chord. 1, 3, 5, well, 6, not technically in the chord yet, 7 of the chord. And that becomes the bass line. And then we have this triplet idea on top of it, that high note. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay? But we also use that rhythm in a slightly different way, breaking that triplet up or merging 2 of the notes of the triplet into 1. So we end up with something like this. So if we're playing our G chord, 2, 3, 4, C, 2, 3, 4, G, 2, 3, 4. Then we, of course, we add our 6. So 3, we've got 3 chords, we've got beats divided into 3, and this idea of 4 beats to a measure, well, that's something that is funny, because if you listen to a lot of early blues, if you listen to any early blues, the earliest recordings of blues, which date back to the 1920s, and of course the music was being made before that, but a lot of it does not fit into neatly packaged 4-beat measures or 12 measure structures, 12 measure, 12 bar blues forms. That comes a little bit later, and it becomes solidified over time to the point where if you try to play blues the way they played it in those days, with a much more open rhythmic form and much less rigidly defined measure structures, if any, then you're going back in time. One thing you notice right away when you listen to a lot of old blues is that the measure structure is not a square 12-bar phrase. I mean, it's kind of like sometimes just what needs to be said has to be said, and it doesn't really matter how many measures you say it. It doesn't matter how many measures it takes. And we're not thinking about measures. We're just thinking about telling a story. sometimes the rhythm goes on as long as it needs to. Sometimes it's odd numbers like 11s and 13s. If you wanted to try to play blues the way Son House played it back in the first half of the 20th century, the way Robert Johnson played it, the way it was played by the people who first put it down on records, and maybe the people who never got to the recording studios. If you wanted to play blues the way they played it, you would really have to go back in time, or you would have to be a kind of curator. It's sort of like if you want to play music from the Renaissance period in Europe or the medieval period in Europe. You can do it, but you'd be doing it as an exercise, really, because it's not really where you're at this moment. And the blues that we play now is not the blues that was played back then, nor can it be. I know it informs my playing. I'm not playing blues as a career. I play blues because I love blues, but it mostly informs what I play and what I write as a songwriter and as an improviser on the guitar. And I want to understand it the best I can. And I want to be able to communicate my understanding of the blues to my students and to whoever will listen, basically, which is why I'm doing this. So there's more. There's always more. But I'm going to leave it there for now. All right, thanks.